Hello everyone, my name is Sean Smith. I'm a graduate student at Texas State University studying digital media, and today I'm presenting some research on news content on Snapchat and Twitter. So the title of my project is Out with the New, In with the Newer, News Content Differences on Snapchat and Twitter. And so some introduction to what led me to choose this topic. I've done some research on various ways news is presented via social media and sort of the history behind that and what fuels journalists and how they choose to use certain media to tell their stories. And I found this work by Fenton from 2010, and it found that technological factors play a role in how journalists work. And so journalists make news depending on the environments in which they work, and these environments are often shaped by a number of factors including economics, politics, social climate, and of course emerging technology. And as news becomes more and more digital native and digital first, these digital and online publications start to exhibit characteristics that are not the same as traditional forms of media such as print and television. And digital and online publications are not bound by space and production limitations such as the time you're allotted for a television broadcast or the amount of pages you have in a newspaper. And Gunter in 2003 found that online news allowed journalists to present their stories in innovative and new ways. And so the idea that these new technologies and these emerging technologies are not only new ways to disseminate this information, but often allow journalists to create new stories and different ways to tell stories was an interesting aspect that I was interested in focusing on. Another aspect that piqued my interest was some research from the Pew Research Center, and it found that more adults than ever get their news via social media. Not only do more adults than ever, but in fact a majority of adults gather news via social media. And some of these new and emerging platforms for social media news gathering started to see increases in news usership. One of these was Snapchat, which saw a 12% increase in news usership over 2016. Some more well-known and longer-standing social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit saw no increase in their news usership over the past year. So this led me to wonder, does news on Snapchat mirror news on traditional social media? And what effects on gatekeeping and agenda setting could we potentially see with this new platform? So some more background information. An early study from 1999 by Sundar found that viewers of news respond differently to the same stories published in different media. So this study looked at how readers perceived news, the exact same story presented either in print or online, and it found that there were differences in the way users or viewers perceived this information. And so this led me to wonder, do journalists tailor certain stories for certain media, or do they change the way they're presented depending on what social media platform they're using? News organizations are also beginning to adopt user-generated content, and this is from a study from 2008. It was a case study that talked to several news organizations and how they plan or were currently adopting user-generated content. And these are examples of like citizen journalism, grassroots journalism, sourcing tweets from a location, things of that nature. And an interesting parallel I found here is that Snapchat mostly functions as a peer-to-peer photo and video sharing application, and users can also upload their content to specific geolocations on the app, and news organizations have the potential to source this content and use it in their reporting. And so I was interested to see if news organizations were using this function of Snapchat. And some more recent literature has actually begun to analyze Snapchat. Snapchat has only been around for about 4 or 5 years, maybe even less. And so the research on it is pretty few and far between. However, there were a few articles I found that shed some interesting light. So Snapchat users were found to use the app to pass time, share problems, and improve social knowledge. And this is an interesting concept because if users mostly look to the app for social interaction and social functions, perhaps the way they use it for news will differ, but also the news organizations who are producing content for this app may play off of these expectations and how users want to use the app and tailor their content in that way. College students were also found to associate Snapchat with feelings of relatability, inclusion, and effortless, and the platform has potential to produce empowering experiences. And again, this all adds to the body of thought that news organizations will have to use this platform in ways different than other social media platforms to really get the true effects that they want and the true interaction that they want from users looking to find news from their sources through this platform. And then Patel in 2017 wrote a news story about Snapchat and the logistics behind how the content is produced and how producers of that content work in tandem with Snapchat. And it found that Snap, the parent company that controls Snapchat, has direct control over what is produced and distributed despite the partnerships with media organizations. And so this raised some interesting flags for me towards the effects of agenda setting and how elites will definitely have control over the content being produced. And then a piece from Blazingame examined Twitter and how it could serve as a means of gatekeeping but was not utilized in that way by journalists. And I have a feeling that Snapchat will be used in a similar way, where the ability to subvert the effects of gatekeeping and agenda setting are present, but will not be used in that way. So I came to this hypothesis after performing the literature review, and that's Snapchat's Discover platform will feature more soft news and entertainment stories than hard news compared to news content on traditional social media outlets. So the method I used to perform this was a content analysis of 5 news organizations who were present on both Twitter and Snapchat. I chose the New York Times, CNN, NBC, BuzzFeed, and SportsCenter. And on November 28th, I collected all of their Snapchat Discover stories from that day using the screen record function on my iPhone. And I categorized the content they produced into these 3 categories: hard news, soft and entertainment news, and opinion and other content. So hard news is anything timely, anything pressing, big news stories of the day. Soft and entertainment news included any sort of news or journalistic content, even things that were just sourcing multiple tweets or fostering a discussion around some sort of viral topic. Those fell into soft and entertainment news. And opinion and other content was basically just a conglomeration of miscellaneous content, opinion pieces, but also just interesting and niche content from the respective platforms. I also looked at the tweets from these accounts using Twitter's advanced search function to allow me to narrow down the original tweets to just those published on November 28th. And I came to these expectations after performing the literature review and using my own experience using Snapchat. I expect that less content will be shared overall on Snapchat, and there will be more soft news on Snapchat than hard news. So here you can see the findings. And overall, for content types on Snapchat, they were all over the place, and there was not really a clear trend between the 5 news organizations. So some interesting points that I'd like to point out is that there's a variation in how many stories overall each news organization used. So BuzzFeed had the most content on Snapchat with 14 different stories, whereas CNN only chose 4. NBC had 7, and a few of them fell in between. CNN, NBC, and SportsCenter all had a majority of hard news on their Snapchat Discover stories, which goes against my expectations and the hypothesis. On Twitter, we see more similar results between all of the organizations and the content overall across all 5. All of the organizations had a majority of soft and entertainment news on Twitter, which went against my expectations that Twitter would be used for hard news. So the main findings I came across were that there are differences in the number of stories and the types of content between the news organizations on Snapchat, whereas they all acted pretty similarly on Twitter. Some interesting key points I pulled out from the actual content itself. NBC's Snapchat story at the end gives a plug and calls it "all the news you need in 2 minutes or less." And the New York Times also featured a content section called 5 Things You Need to Know. And these are interesting implications towards agenda setting because it is implying that the content that they're dispersing through this medium is what is most important. I also found that none of the news organizations utilized any user-generated content on Snapchat. However, quote tweets, retweets, and interactions were not monitored on Twitter, and so I was unable to compare this. Some interesting implications I drew. There were content differences, though most of them were not statistically significant. My hypothesis was not confirmed, as there was more soft news on Twitter than there was on Snapchat Discover, and what news content was dispersed on Snapchat Discover varied widely between the 5 news sources. However, this dataset varied in size, and the reliability of the statistics was questionable, so I definitely believe that there needs to be a refinement in the sampling process, the coding, and the analysis that should be performed in future studies. However, this provided a preliminary glimpse at the potential content differences between Snapchat Discover and Twitter, and perhaps the content is too natively different for accurate comparison. Some of the content on Snapchat could not exist in any form on Twitter, such as this piece from BuzzFeed. And oftentimes the content on Twitter is linked to a website, whereas Snapchat content is niche and tailored and created specifically for that platform. The potential for gate jumping on Snapchat was not utilized, and there could still be agenda setting effects present. And some more questions that I'd like to explore in the future. What makes some content more effective than others? And so this would require some sort of experimental design or survey.